So the way that you present this with we have three pretty strong data points across the ETH BTC ratio that you're pointing out about the bleed into the upside. It seems like it's all going according to plan. At least kind of that's the vibe that I got from you. The ETH BTC ratio is in the middle of its starting its fourth pattern that we've seen for the last 3 cycles. And if you believe in patterns repeating themselves, then we are perfectly on track for that. And there's not really much reason to think that we're outside of that bound. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, my long-term view for ETH Bitcoin really since 2021 was that it was going to bleed to about 0.03 to 0.04. So
you called this ETH coming home, right?
yeah. It's basically it bleeds to the 0.03 to 0.04 range, and that's why I've been so bearish on ETH Bitcoin. And I know I've made a lot of ETH people mad, but it was what I saw happen last cycle, and I was like, you know what? I do think there's a time to be bullish on Ethereum against Bitcoin, but I think a lot of people have they front run it. They think that it's going to give them outsized gains compared to Bitcoin, but I think it was a little too premature. And so what's really interesting though is at this point I think it's far too late, right, to make that trade. I mean, I think the time to make it would have been back over here in 2021. But if you look here at when ETH Bitcoin breaks down, like the last couple of times, after the first month that it broke down, right here, 2016, and then here in 2019, it only went down for 1 to 2 more months before ETH Bitcoin really bottomed out, right? And so I think that it's going to turn around relatively soon. But the reason, I mean, it could still go below 0.04, right? It absolutely could still go below 0.04. But I will say this, if it does not go below 0.04 before the end of the year, then my guess is it's probably not going to, okay? But in the short term, I would say there still is a chance. And the reason why I still remain, I don't really even want to call it super bearish because it's already hit my target range of 0.03 to 0.04. So it did hit 0.04. So I remind myself, all right, there is a chance that the low's already in. But the reason why I would still express some skepticism towards that idea is last cycle, we know if we overlay 2 things, if we overlay interest rates, you can see that ETH Bitcoin bottomed out after rate cuts, right? So it was about a month after the first rate cut. So the first rate cut was in July. It was actually July 31st of 2019. And then ETH Bitcoin bottomed out the first week of September. So it was basically just a month later. And then also what's actually, I think, a bigger signal than just rate cuts is the balance sheet of the Fed, actually. So if you overlay the balance sheet of the Fed, you can see that it was precisely when the Fed pivoted here from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. That's what marked the bottom for ETH Bitcoin, right? Right here. You see that right where they pivoted? That's ultimately what marked the bottom last cycle for ETH Bitcoin. And that is likely going to happen sometime in the next few months. And the reason why is it's not because the Fed cares about Ethereum, right? We know they don't. They don't care about the crypto markets. But the reason why we're likely going to see this pivot occur is because, just to briefly get into the macro side of things, right? The unemployment rate is starting to look a little scary, right? It's sort of entered into its nonlinear phase where it's moving up a lot quicker than it had been previously. And so when it does something like this, right? I'm not really sure why this one's a lot bigger, but when it does something like that, when the unemployment rate starts to move up this quickly, that's when the Fed is going to start to respond. So because the Fed's reaction function, because the Fed's likely going to react in the next few months, it likely means that ETH Bitcoin will bottom out in the next few months because monetary policy is about to change.
Ben, I dream one day to be able to chart like you, man. This is just incredible.
No, I've don't, seen, Ryan. You've never tried charting.
I haven't never tried, but if there was one, skill set, I could just matrix style. Somebody could plug into my neural net. It would be charting. It wouldn't be athletic skills. It'd be charting. But I don't want to do the work to get there because there's people like Ben who've already done it. So we were looking at some charts where Ben was doing an overlay on the ETH Bitcoin ratio of the Fed balance sheet. And also the interest rate, and that's really cool. And so I guess we're getting the picture of the true driver of these 4-year cycles. It's not really the halving. It's more the Fed and liquidity and interest rate. Is that kind of the true force behind all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, I don't even think you can look at even Bitcoin and say that the reason it went up was only because of the ETFs, right? The reality is that Bitcoin is sort of a more volatile version of the NASDAQ. And the NASDAQ, right, if you overlay the NAS, this is actually really fascinating when you look at the market this way. When you overlay the NASDAQ with Bitcoin, when Bitcoin started to go parabolic in Q4 in anticipation of the ETF, the NASDAQ was also going parabolic, right?
Hmm.
So it's not even, I don't even think we can definitively say that it was the ETF. I'm not saying the ETF had no effect. It absolutely did. But my point is that if the NASDAQ
Mm.
were going down in Q4 of last year, then there's a good chance Bitcoin would have as well, right? But it was because, we were generally in risk on conditions. But I think one thing to note, and just another similarity between this cycle and last cycle, is that I think a lot of people have sort of said like, well, what's going on? Like, why have equities gone up while crypto's gone down? And actually, what's really fascinating is the same exact thing happened last cycle, right? There is a period last cycle where you can see it pretty clearly where Bitcoin was going down while the Nasdaq was going up. After, right? That was when ETH Bitcoin broke down. That was also when gold broke out. Was right here. Gold broke out right there. Same thing has happened this time, right? You can look over here and see that the NASDAQ has trended up while Bitcoin has been slowly trending down. So I think a lot of the same things are playing out. Again, I think the main difference is that instead of occurring in the pre-halving year, it's all occurring in the halving year. But you could argue that the 4-year cycle still could be intact. It's just the timing of everything is just offset by one year.
Okay, and so let's maybe recap kind of where we are. So you think base case is we're in the first part of the 4-year bull cycle yet again. And this is the quantitative tightening part of it. It's not the quantitative easing part of it, which we could start after Powell starts to lower rates. And we may be in probably the bottoming range of the ETH Bitcoin ratio. It still could go lower, but we're kind of close to where you feel like it's going. How about ETH? With respect to dollars. So have we seen lows there, or are we going to dip below 2,000?
I've gotten in a lot of trouble. I'll just be honest, guys. I've gotten in a lot of trouble with my views on Ethereum.
Who's causing you trouble? It's just
No, the Twitter trolls, right? No,
Okay.
mainly because I've sort of been of the opinion for the last few years, right? If you're gonna buy anything, just buy Bitcoin because ETH is gonna underperform, right? And so I've had these bear goggles on for Ethereum because I just kept thinking well, why buy ETH when I can buy Bitcoin if ETH Bitcoin's gonna go down? I'm starting to force myself to see the other side of it because I think we're, as you just said, right? I think we're actually near the end of the ETH Bitcoin downturn. But as far as ETH USD, there's actually kind of a pattern here as well. You could almost argue that what has happened here is the same thing that happened in 2019. It looks a lot different because it's taken a lot longer. But
Yeah.
I think if you overlay rates, if you overlay interest rates, you can see what I'm talking about, I believe. So do you see how this cycle over here, rates only went up to 2.5% and then they came down?
Mm-hmm.
This time they went more than double that, right? Where they went to 5.5%. But if you look at the chart like this, basically what happened last cycle is that ETH formed this wedge that it was bouncing around between. All right. And if you put a price label here, you can see it bottomed out around what, $80? Around $80. This was not this cycle, right? Obviously the 2019 cycle. And then it had a higher low at around 100, and then it had another low at around 150 before rallying up. And then you can see that it fell back into the wedge right before rate cuts arrived, where it went down to, guess what? Guess where it went down to? It went the wick on this return to the wedge. The low was 190. So this move from 2019 is basically 1/10 of the move we've seen this cycle, right? So instead of ETH bottoming out right at 80, 100, 150, and then 200, it's been just 10 times that, right? 10 times all of that. So you have 800, right? 1,000, 1,500, and now this wick that we just saw went to 1,900, right? So it's basically the same thing. And the reason I think it's taking place on a grander scale is because the rate hike part of the cycle has taken place over a much longer time frame. right? So when you look at it like this, right? So we can see that it's just a 10x move of the prior cycle. When you look at it like this, you can see that ETH has fallen back into the wedge just like it did in 2019. And what's even more fascinating is if you zoom in here, it was right after the first rate cut. The first rate cut last cycle was July 31st. And it was right after that rate cut that ETH USD broke to the downside. And it occurred in the third quarter of the year. It occurred in August. And so the downturn lasted a little bit longer into Q4. And then you could argue that was the soft landing, right? So that would have been the soft landing. Now we ended up getting a hard landing because of the pandemic, but that would have been the soft landing. So like I have to, as much as, it's taken forever, right? And there's been every reason to sort of, make fun of these views because it's been taking far longer than I thought, which is fascinating because I actually thought the Fed would raise rates to 5.5%. I thought they would keep them higher for longer. I've actually was pretty amazed by how long the crypto markets held up. And I think it is a reflection that a lot of people do find value in the crypto markets. And even though Ethereum hasn't set new all-time highs, remember last cycle, it first ETH Bitcoin had to break down, it had to go home as I've said, and then after that is what led the rally into new all-time highs. And I mean, you can see that in 2016, right? I mean, this rally was an explosive rally out of here, right? Same thing the following cycle. Again, if you just sort of ignore the pandemic drop, it was getting a pretty strong rally out of that. So I think that something similar could happen again. I'm not suggesting that people should try to, time everything, right? Like that's impossible. And frankly, I could be wrong, right? I mean, just because my views on ETH Bitcoin have been correct does not mean that my views on ETH USD will continue to be correct, at least for March, because I underestimated it. I absolutely underestimated it. So I think it's important for people to recognize that, right? I don't have a crystal ball. I'm just doing the best I can. And actually, as far as Bitcoin is concerned and the ETH Bitcoin ratio, I absolutely think it's time to start hedging those views, right? And that could just mean, instead of being like 99 or 100% Bitcoin for your portfolio because of, the Bitcoin dominance rally, it might mean sort of tailoring that back, especially as we get closer to the end of the year, because that's normally when Bitcoin dominance goes down. So my base case right now is that ETH USD, it still stays up here a little bit longer above 2K. It goes below 2K in Q4. And then starting next year, it then bounces out of that. And then hopefully we'll see if, I mean, my hope is that the Fed has not absolutely wrecked the markets, for a long time. Because I think the sort of the caveat to this is, as actually you mentioned earlier, is that what happens if we deviate off the 4-year cycle, and that's always a possibility. If the Fed, obviously, if we get a recession or something, that could change things, right? And then all bets are off. But I think that's going to be the base case for right now, is that there's still going to be some weakness going into the end of the year. And that is where things should turn around. And by the way, when ETH USD fell back into this wedge, right here, it bottomed at 190, which is where we just bottomed, 10x 1900, and then it rallied back up to right around 240. So and right now it's right below 2400. So I'm wondering if it's just going to hang out here for a couple more weeks after rate cuts fall off. Everyone freaks out because they're like, oh, the recession's here. But in reality, that is just where it was always going to go.
That's the bottom. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. That's where it was always just going to go anyways, and where we were going to find a reason for it. And then from there, I think you could make a strong case that it could get a pretty big bounce out of that. I think another thing that we all have to remember is that by the time, even if we do have a recession, right, by the time it's declared, normally the markets have bottomed by then. So, I mean, like if the Fed comes out in 2025 and like, oh yeah, we were in a recession, the markets probably knew that well ahead of time. And one last thing, I think actually that one of the really great things about crypto, I think it has a way of sniffing out that weakness before, say, the stock market does, right? Because I mean, crypto's been in a downturn since March. And maybe the reason for that is in the stock market, you have all these like passive 401k investing going on, whereas in crypto, it's not exactly the same thing. So I do wonder, I wonder if Bitcoin and Ethereum have sort of sniffed out that weakness half a year before the stock market, has sniffed it out. So by the time the markets get back down here, it's all been priced in, right? And then it just gets a big move out of it, just like it did the last 2 cycles.
So Ben, your takes on Ether from the prices are complex, and I can imagine how they don't make you like a fan favorite among the ETH bulls on crypto Twitter, at least. But it sounds like you're saying basically the ETH Bitcoin ratio has come home, according to your predictions, according to the charting that you're doing. And also the ETH dollar price is pretty close to home too. I mean, we're within a few miles of we could see the front porch, maybe we're pretty close. And if that kind of continues into Q4, is there a period of time in or let's say Q1 2025 or in 2025 in general, are you going to full switch on Ether? You did call it a blue chip asset earlier, and you said you only consider 2 blue chip assets in crypto, Bitcoin and Ether. Can we anticipate a possible future of 2025, Ben, where you are Ethereum's biggest bull?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think Ethereum will start to outperform Bitcoin in 2025. I feel pretty confident about that. Again, I could be wrong. Again, it wouldn't be the first time, but I do think absolutely that it will start to turn around as we get closer to 2025. My base case right now is that it just bottoms out sometime between now and the end of the year.
If you enjoyed all of that, then you'll absolutely love the Bankless newsletter. Join over 300,000 fellow readers, all for free. Click below to sign up.